We've been talking about the 1950s, and the last couple of lessons have really focused on what it meant to have some prosperity, moving to the suburbs, advertising, medical technologies, corporate issues, work. But what we want to show you is that in this case, it's not entirely going to be all prosperity. Lots of Americans still are going to be remaining poor. Lots of them are still going to live below the poverty line. We're going to see all kinds of issues like tax bases in cities begin to collapse, and the cities themselves begin to collapse and become poor. You're going to see all kinds of issues that really target the poorest of the poor in our society and those that are often mistreated or neglected, including African Americans, Mexican immigrants, Native Americans, and even the poor in Appalachia, which is a region of America. So what we're going to start here by taking a look at this is that when it comes to how people respond to prosperity, it's that even in the 1950s, we're going to have poverty amid that prosperity, that not everywhere we go will we see people necessarily living in great prosperity. Because in the 1950s, a lot of Americans are still going to be impoverished. 1 out of every 5 Americans is going to live below the poverty line. That line that we have, it's called a poverty line. It's kind of an imaginary line, right? The government says anyone above this line that makes more than this, they're not poor. And anyone that's below this line, well, they are going to be poor. And there's all kinds of poverty lines. There's poverty lines based upon the minimum needed to support a family of 4, a family of 5, whatever it might be. Lots of these poor are going to be single mothers, they're going to be elderly, they're going to be ethnic minorities. You're going to have all kinds of people that are really kind of struggling with this issue of poverty. Let me show you what I mean in terms of kind of what that line looks like. In 1950, if you had a family of 4, it was $11,490 if you had a family of 4, that's your poverty line. Anything below that, you're impoverished. 2015, that line is $24,250. That's that kind of poverty line that we're seeing people at in America. The average middle class salary for a person right now in America, like the middle of the middle, is right around 50 grand. That's pretty much where that is. So a substantial amount there. And the poverty lines today, they're not what you might think, right? So if it's just one person living in a household, if you make less than $11,000, you're impoverished. If it's 2 people, it's $15,000, and so on down the line. And you can see what that looks like here. But what you need to take away from this is that in no way, shape, or form is this issue of poverty really something that's going to go away. It's always going to be with us throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. I want to show you a couple of things here. I want to show you the poverty rate versus the number of people in poverty. And what you can see is that the poverty rate in the 1960s and 70s continues to decline, and it remains relatively low. But what's interesting here is that the number of people that are in poverty, that doesn't remain low. And what you need to remember is that, this is important, there are different ways to count poverty. In fact, do me a favor and write poverty on a slip of paper tomorrow and bring that in. That's the word I'm going to want to collect from you tomorrow, poverty. There's different ways to count poverty. So while we'll see a poverty rate of around 15% on this slide, we might see a poverty rate of around 30% if we're talking about children, or 40% if we're looking at people that are in poverty for a part of the year. There's just lots and lots and lots of different ways to count poverty. When it comes down to nations, for example, if you look at a certain kind of way of counting poverty, you'll see America has a poverty rate of 21, almost 22%. So there really is just a lot of different ways to take a look at where and how people are considered poor. But the bottom line, the takeaway from this, is that America experiences a great number of people in poverty starting in the 1950s, and that's going to continue up to today. And one of the reasons that that's going to happen is that our cities are going to become increasingly poor. As the wealthy and the middle class move out of cities to the suburbs, they're going to leave behind the poor. Well, the poor don't pay as much in taxes. When the poor don't pay as much in taxes, it gets harder and harder to take care of the city, whether it's education or public transportation or libraries or housing or hospitals. It becomes increasingly difficult This is what urban decay looks like. This is modern day Camden, New Jersey, one of the cities in America that has the most urban decay. It has a population primarily of impoverished people. And because of that, it is unable to keep its infrastructure going. And you can see what that urban decay looks like. The American government is going to try and respond by doing something called urban renewal. And the idea here is that we're going to build low-cost housing, we're going to tear down slums, and we're going to allow people who lived in those slums to move into this low-cost housing. Here's an example from Southwest Washington, D.C. in the 1950s and 60s. You can see a lot of these apartment high-rises right here, and all of these places will now include the impoverished. And this is a really big deal because I want you to think about, for tomorrow's lesson, what's going to happen to these areas when you move a large number of impoverished people into one region. And I want you to think about that in terms of work, in terms of education, in terms of crime, and so on and so forth. I think a really good image to kind of show you what this looks like is one that comes out of St. Louis. This is a 1950s, 1960s housing project in St. Louis, and you can see what they attempted to do. We have here a whole series of slums that will be torn down and removed, and we've replaced them with all of these apartment buildings. And again, the same concept applies. Think about what happens to the neighborhoods as you concentrate poverty in these particular locations. Another way of looking at this, ladies and gents, will be right here. Here we have a city and its taxes. As long as the population is here, we have wealthy, we have middle class, we have impoverished people, our tax base is good. Well, what's going to happen here is that over time, the middle class and the upper class will move out, and that population will lower, as it's just the impoverished. And as a result, the tax base will lower, making it harder to take care of these different places.